Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Carbon Capture Magazine's bi-weekly podcast. I'm your host, Dana Bastian. Today, we will be chatting with Matt Fry, Senior Policy Manager at the Great Plains Institute. Welcome, Matt. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Great. Matt, having over 20 years experience in natural resource management, regulation, and policy in both the public and private sectors, and now currently being the senior policy manager supporting the carbon management program at the Great Plains Institute. Can you tell us a bit more about your background and how you became involved in the CCUS industry?
Yeah, you bet. So historically, I worked in fisheries biology, which makes a lot of sense with the transition over into carbon management, obviously. But over time, I guess I worked my way more into the policy realm of the game and fish agencies kind of across the country. And at some point, got really actively involved in NEPA processes, National Environmental Policy Act, environmental impact statements, and so forth, working on specific natural resource issues. So, working under the kind of the umbrella of previous governor in Wyoming, I started to work pretty heavily on linear infrastructure projects. We had some large pipeline projects like the Ruby natural gas pipeline, and then we also had some very large electricity transmission line projects coming through the state, moving our resources to other states. So I became heavily involved in those and just very active and somewhat successful in my role to kind of help mitigate impacts associated with those projects. So that was a long way of getting around to eventually, under Governor Meade, I was tasked with coming on board to do two things. One, serve as a senior policy advisor to him, and then also to manage a project in Wyoming called the Wyoming Pipeline Corridor Initiative, which was a intrastate 2,000-mile pipeline corridor system that we developed and had federal authorization on to help move carbon dioxide and any associated products from enhanced recovery activities throughout the state. So it helps facilitate the build out of those projects. And just over time with policies and projects, I've become more and more active in the CCUS world.
Great. Yeah, it seems like you've kind of run the gamut of all the different things that are in that carbon management realm. Kind of leading into a good segue for our next question, actually. What does it really mean to be carbon management ready?
I think you can look at it from a number of different perspectives. Clearly, from an industry perspective, to be carbon management ready, you have to have buildable projects with reliable technology. You have to have a source. You have to have some sort of transport infrastructure, and you have to have a sink or something to do with that CO2 figured out. So from them, it's a technical and economic capacity to build projects. And then from a state, I think it's a completely different perspective on what it means to be carbon management ready. So states, they kind of being the home for carbon management projects, need to have a number of things in place. They require laws that allow for projects to be built. So they need to establish who owns the pore space, cradle to grave CO2 ownership. They need to figure out how to unitize or amalgamate pore space. Got to figure out who's going to manage these CO2 injection projects for, basically perpetuity. And then they have to figure out who's going to manage all of these, what agency or entity is going to manage all of these issues and how they're going to pay for it. So from a state perspective, they really need to figure out how to make themselves available to build out these projects.
Yeah, that's a great point. And do you see some states maybe have more opportunity than others when it comes to carbon capture potential?
Yeah, I think that there's kind of a curve here. We have a number of states who've been working on this for honestly decade plus. I live in Wyoming. We've worked on it here for a long time, and we're ready from a statutory framework. North Dakota's ready. Louisiana's well situated. We had a number of states in this past legislative session that enacted statutes that allow them to move down this pathway. So I think the states that are available with those statutory frameworks have an opportunity to move sooner. I think there's also a technical aspect. States with less emission sources would be less likely to house projects to build out, as well as states without the opportunity to utilize pore space or actually subsequently use that CO2 would have less of an opportunity. So some of our research and our written materials at GPI kind of describe which states have more opportunities in the near term, but there's clearly a curve as to who's going to be ready first.
Yeah, absolutely. There's always got to be somebody first and somebody last, right? And
Correct.
speaking of that, what are some incentives for states to implement carbon capture technology if they have not already started that process?
That's a good question. So it's such a nascent industry that there's a lot of question on what the economic benefits are to doing it. We clearly know what the climate benefits are, and there's so those are a strong incentive that can help states move and support carbon management projects. But I think we also have to look at maintaining existing industries. Like there's opportunities to allow things like those hard to abate industrial products or industries to continue to move forward if they're allowed to implement carbon management projects. And then there's the opportunity to build new infrastructure and industries associated with these, such as direct air capture and all of these things that we hear about now that are new and just being built up. So there's that aspect. There's certainly a tax base associated with this. So as project developers buy and build and utilize state resources, there's a tax opportunity for states. So there's an income basis for them, and then jobs. And we're going to see a lot of jobs change as we move through this energy transition. So as states become carbon management ready, they have the opportunity to hold on to existing jobs as well as develop or offer opportunities for new jobs.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great incentive for those states to kind of get on board with those. And kind of switching gears for a second, what advice do you have for organizations that would like to or are in the early stages of implementing carbon management?
Great question. So 10 years ago, this was a really tough question to answer because things were so new and so few states and entities had done any thing, from a statutory perspective. And, while we've done carbon management projects for over 50 years, it was still kind of new to folks. But I think at this point, folks coming into the game have the opportunity to look at what other states and other industries have done, so they don't need to reinvent the wheel. They can kind of move forward down these pathways to develop projects or statutory frameworks or whatever they choose or need to do. So rather than trying to develop everything from scratch, look around, see what other states have done, see what they've done well, see what they've done poorly, and learn from those to allow yourself to move forward more quickly than those of us that were first, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of from those learning lessons, what would you say, what are some of the most difficult obstacles to overcome when striving for that status of carbon management ready?
I think this one's pretty much evident that moving forward legislation in any state, no matter what your political leaning is really challenging. So that's one of the biggest challenges and obstacles to moving forward is having legislative authority, statutory framework, laws on the books, regulations, and so forth that allow for these projects to move forward. So yeah, to help incentivize or to move this down the pathways, it's a really good opportunity, or provides a really good opportunity to help educate and inform people on the opportunities and the benefits associated with this. I mean, clearly there are some challenges associated with deploying projects, but there's a lot of opportunities. So I think educating folks on those opportunities is how we overcome these obstacles.
That's a great point. And kind of leaning back into that legislation, obviously, recently, as of yesterday, actually, the Inflation Reduction Act passed. So, how do you see that maybe going to affect some of the carbon capture industry moving forward, how that will benefit them? As something new, this is probably one of the biggest, climate change initiative bills that have been passed in decades. So, just kind of wanted to gauge your interest on that and see where you think that's going to lead for the carbon capture industry.
Yeah, no, this is a timely question for sure. So, back in 2018, when the Section 45Q tax code was amended, at the time we thought that that was the economic bridge that was going to push projects across the finish line. But since then we've had all kinds of challenges. We've gone through COVID. We've had chain issues associated with getting natural resources and products. So there's been a lot of challenges associated with that. In addition, things have gotten more expensive. So that 45Q tax credit was not as valuable to help promote project development as it would have been back, 4 or 5 years ago. So I think one of the biggest things that the IRA will do is kind of push or push forward a higher incentive for folks to develop these projects that store CO2. So I'm hopeful, and I think that a lot of folks are going to be pushing projects along now that that additional incentive is available, in addition to all the other opportunities that are available in the IRA, plus what's available in the bipartisan infrastructure law that was passed earlier. So a lot of incentive and opportunities to move projects forward, and I think it's really the time to start building things.
Absolutely. I think on behalf of Carbon Capture Magazine, we couldn't agree more on that as well. And Matt, is there anything new with the Great Plains Institute that you would like to share with our listeners?
No, GPI, we're building and growing. We've been doing this for over 20 years now, but we've over time built and become more diverse and had a lot more expertise within the organization. So happy to meet folks as we get around and talk to folks on both in person as well as podcasts and opportunities like these. So we're super excited about the opportunities coming forward in carbon management. And as I like to say, it is now time to start turning dirt and building projects.
I absolutely love that. I think that's a perfect way to end. Well, thank you so much, Matt, for sharing your expertise with our listeners today. It was an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation.
Our pleasure. And to our listeners, until next time.